everybody! So today we're going to start talking about solving absolute value inequalities. Up until now we've been focused on what are called absolute value equations, which means our problems always had an equals sign in them. When we're solving absolute value inequalities, instead of seeing an equal sign, we're going to see a less than, a greater than, a less than or equal to, or a greater than or equal to. So we're still going to have an absolute value, but now we're going to have one of these other symbols as well. Let's start with just some vocabulary. An absolute value inequality is an inequality that uses an absolute value in its equation. So an example of one of these problems would be absolute value of 3x minus 2 is less than 5. What makes this an absolute value inequality is that we have these absolute value symbols and we also have a less than symbol, which is a type of inequality. So what we're going to do now is learn how to set up and solve these problems. There are going to be two basic types of these problems. The first type is going to be what we call a less than problem. Any absolute value inequality that uses a less than or a less than or equal to looks like an AND graph. Now you may remember learning to do AND graphs when we did compound inequalities. So sometimes we call these graphs less than graphs to remind us that when it's a less than, it's actually an AND graph. So we say less than, sort of a memory trick. Here's what this means. If we want all the numbers whose absolute value is less than or equal to 3, what we're going to do first is start by creating a sandwich. And here's what I mean by creating a sandwich. We're going to make a compound inequality that is an AND inequality. So the x, which is inside of the parentheses, inside the absolute value, is going to go in the middle. Then we're going to make a sandwich. Since it's a sandwich, both sides of that x are going to be less than symbols. Just like the original symbol, but now we have two of them. It's a sandwich where the symbols are the bread and the x is like the cheese in the middle. Now on the outside of the sandwich, we're going to fill in some numbers. So the number that's going to go all the way on the right side is the same number you started with. And the number that's going to go all the way on the left side will be the same number but negative. Once you set it up like this, you graph this the same way we graphed AND compound inequalities. So what that means is we put a closed circle on the negative 3 because it's an equal to. We put a closed circle on the positive 3 and we shade in the middle because the x is in the middle. So whenever you see a less than, you remember it's an AND, so you make a sandwich where the x is the cheese and the less thans are like the bread. Now, whenever you see a greater than, which is the second type of inequality that we're going to see, an absolute value inequality that uses a greater than symbol or a greater than or equal to symbol doesn't look like an AND graph anymore. It's going to look like an OR graph. Now, you may have an easier time remembering this if instead of saying greater, you say great or. Do you get it? So now, if we want to set up this problem in a way that makes it easy to graph, we're going to change this into an OR problem. So when you have an OR problem, the word OR goes in the middle. Now the original problem is going to get copied down first, but without the absolute value. So this is the same as the original. Then we're also going to copy down the second problem, which is going to take the original, it's going to flip the inequality over and change the number to a negative. So I call this flip change. Flip the inequality over, change it to a negative. Now we know how to graph things like this. X is greater than 3, we would put a closed circle on the 3. X is less than or equal to -3, we would put a closed circle on the -3. And then we would shade out because of the OR. The OR tells us to shade out. The reason we like to change these to either AND problems or OR problems is because we know how to do those already. So rather than learning something new, we're just going to take these new problems and turn them into something old. So let's take a look at number 1. In number 1, the first thing I notice is that this is a less than symbol. Now in my mind, I know that I should think that this is a less than. So I'm going to turn this into an AND problem. In an AND problem, whatever is inside the absolute value goes in the middle, and we make a sandwich of less than or equal to symbols, because the symbols should be the same, it's just the bread of the sandwich. Now we're going to copy the first number and leave it alone all the way over here. And we're going to change it to a negative over here. Now if I graph this, I put a closed circle on the -8. I would put a closed circle on the +8. And I would shade in between because the X is in between. Let's take a look at an OR problem now. So in number 3, the first thing I notice is that this is a greater than symbol, which I like to think of as a greater than symbol. So when it's an OR problem, in the middle we're going to put the word OR. The first thing we're going to copy down is the same as the original. V is greater than 2. The second thing we're going to copy down is the same as the original, but we're going to do a flip change. So we're going to flip the inequality over and change it to a -2. Now when I graph this, I would put an open circle on the +2, an open circle on the -2, and I would shade on the outside because this is an OR problem, which means we shade on the outside. Let's take a look, instead of doing 2 and 4, let's go ahead and take a look at some slightly more complicated problems. So number 5 looks a lot like the other problems, but now we've got some stuff inside of the absolute value. So instead of just a W or just an X, inside of this absolute value we have a 2W minus 1. Let's take a look at how we would do this. The first thing we would do is identify the type of symbol, the inequality that's here. This is a less than symbol, which I like to think about as a less than symbol, because that reminds me that this should be an AND problem. Now in the previous problems, we just put X in the middle, but in this problem, we're going to end up putting 2W minus 1 in the middle of our sandwich because that entire thing is inside of the absolute value. Then we're going to put a sandwich of inequalities. So we're going to put less thans on both sides. On the right side of the sandwich, we keep the 11 the same. And on the left side of the sandwich, we change it to a -11. Now, when I see a problem like this reminds me of when I needed to solve compound inequalities. So before I can graph here, I'm going to end up solving. I'm going to add 1 on all 3 parts to get W by itself. So I'm going to have negative 10 is less than 2W, which is less than 12. Then I'm going to divide by 2 in all 3 parts, which means I get negative 5 is less than W, which is less than 6. When I graph this, I'm going to put a closed circle on the negative 5. I'm sorry, an open circle. That was my bad. I was going too fast. We're going to put an open circle on the positive 6. Let me use my whiteout on there. There we go. Okay, open. There we go. Fixed it. An open circle on the positive 6, and we would shade in between because the W is in between. Now let's look at an example of a great or then problem. So in the next problem, number 6, we would start by identifying the type of inequality we have. This is a greater than, but I like to think of that as a great or then. Now, just like in the previous problem, we're going to start with filling in the word or, just like we did on the other page. The first thing we're going to be writing down is the same as the original problem. X minus 3 is greater than 5. The second thing we're going to write down is x minus 3, but now we're going to do the flip change. So we're going to flip the inequality, change it to a negative 5. You couldn't quite see what I was writing there. There we go. All right, now, once again, this reminds me of problems where I needed to solve first before I could graph them. So I'm going to start by adding 3 on both sides of this inequality, and I get x is greater than 8. I'm going to bring down the word or, and then I'm going to solve. I'm going to add 3 on both sides of the inequality, and I get x is less than negative 2. Now, when I graph this, I'm going to put an open circle on the 8, an open circle on the negative 2, and I'm going to shade on the outside because of the word or. We're going to go ahead and stop there for today. You've seen one of each type of example. Thank you so much for watching the video. We will definitely be spending some more time in class the next time I see you talking about this and going over some practice problems. Have a great night.